I think it's kind of any RCT is by definition longitudinal. One is doing an intervention and one is following up individuals over time. So the question is just one of timescale. And in this case, the initial timescale was envisaged to be about 10 years. So it's already a relatively long study. The issues that come to mind when one thinks about this are planning for, and if one was planning a life course study, one would have to think through what is the end outcome, right, that one would be interested in studying. How many people would one need to have at the end point? And how does one design the study to minimize attrition and start with a sample that is large enough that even after attrition and after all the reasons why attrition occurs, which I could go into in the Guatemala study, for example, remains a study that is large enough to be useful to answer scientific questions. Any kind of long-term study is, if one's interested in looking at the early, as I am, in the early origins of adult chronic disease, the question is always one, well, what was collected in early childhood that one can then use as baseline data? So if I was starting a study now as a nutritional epidemiologist, I was interested in young children, I would collect microbiome samples, I would collect blood samples, I would collect DNA samples, I would collect all sorts of things and put them in long-term storage. This was not done back in the 1960s. It was not envisaged at the time as being a long-term repository. And it is that long-term repository that eventually lends itself to very robust long-term studies. It's very difficult to, or often impossible, to go back and recreate the early life circumstances. Sometimes you can do it by interview, but there's very few biomarkers of early life exposures that can be collected later on in life.